The story begins with the protagonist recalling how his mother had always insisted he had the qualities of a shaman, constantly pressuring him to follow that path. Despite her persistent demands, he chose to focus on his studies, resisting her influence for 10 long years until he finally broke free and moved away to start a life of his own. But just as he was about to begin this new chapter, something shocking happened: he died. The suddenness of it made him wonder if this was the wrath his mother had always warned him about. Yet, instead of simply passing away, he found himself reborn in another world. In this new life, he took on the role of a professor at a magic academy, a position he accepted as part of an undercover mission. The scene then shifts to a bustling town with a busy train station. Among the crowd, a man checks his ticket before boarding the train. The protagonist enters cabin 403 and meets an older gentleman there. Their interaction is polite and formal, with the man introducing himself as Gerrard. They soon strike up a conversation. They discuss the recent end of the civil war in the Kingdom of Utah and talk about the key figures involved in the conflict. The conversation turns to rumors about a wandering mercenary named Machiavelli, a name that makes the protagonist pause. It's one of the aliases he used in his past life. This revelation adds a new layer of complexity to his already complicated identity and mission. Gerrard then asks about the protagonist's role as a professor at Ceoren Academy. He's surprised by the protagonist's young age and skill, noting the difficulty of the academy's entrance exams. The protagonist downplays his abilities, but inwardly appreciates the compliment. When Gerrard inquires about his plans at the academy, the protagonist mentions he has been assigned to teach the second-year students, a position of significant responsibility. As the train moves along, their conversation is abruptly interrupted by a sudden explosion that rocks the carriage, catching everyone off guard. Both Gerrard and the protagonist immediately go on high alert. Gerrard wonders if the engine might have exploded, but the protagonist quickly dismisses that idea, knowing the train should be well protected against such incidents. They quickly deduce that the train is being ambushed, likely targeting a wealthy merchant or noble on board. They step out of their cabin to assess the situation and realize the explosion happened in Car 3. They suspect the bandits are headed toward Car 1, where the first-class passengers are. Just then, a bandit jumps in through a window behind them. The protagonist tells Gerrard to stay back, but they quickly notice something is off about the bandit. The bandit suddenly lunges at them, but the protagonist swiftly uses magic to paralyze him. Pinning the bandit down, he demands to know their motives. But instead of answering, the bandit starts laughing and reveals a time bomb strapped to his chest. The timer is about to hit 0. A massive explosion occurs, and we see Gerrard barely dodging it. As he struggles to stand up, he searches for Ludger, only to realize that both the bandit and Gerrard are nowhere to be seen. They must have fallen off the cliff. As the dust settles, we see something like a mask on Gerrard's face. He mutters to himself about the fortune he spent on creating it. When he takes off the mask, it's revealed that Gerrard is the real protagonist, and he had been using a fake identity all along. He sighs, wondering why bad things keep happening to him. Protagonist says that he picked Machiavelli name just because it was a famous name in his past life. Throughout his travels, he often changed his identity, and Machiavelli was just one of his many aliases. He didn't like the attention it brought him, preferring to stay hidden. Luckily, after the royal princess army celebrated their victory a bit too much, he managed to assume a new identity and board a train headed for Linderbrunn. But then, trouble struck again. He wondered why such events always seemed to find him. He said a silent farewell to the real Ludger. The bandit who attacked them was no ordinary criminal. Despite being paralyzed, he had managed to set off explosives. The protagonist suspected this was the work of a religious fanatic targeting the train, not for money or passengers, but for something more sinister. As he pondered this, a man who appeared to be a staff member approached and asked what had happened. The protagonist replied that armed bandits had attacked the train and suggested they head towards the caboose, as the bandits might be after the first car. The staff member agreed, mentioning that they were already evacuating passengers in that direction. Suddenly, the protagonist grabbed the staff member by the neck and pinned him down. The staff member, shocked, asked what he was doing. The protagonist accused him of being part of the plot, pointing out that the bandits couldn't have ambushed a speeding train through rough terrain or breached its protection spell without inside help. Realizing he had been caught, the staff member tried to stab the protagonist. However, the protagonist was quicker and pinned his hand down. He demanded to know what the bandits were after and who they were. As he forced the staff member to walk, his sixth sense kicked in. He pushed the staff member aside and ducked, just in time to dodge bullets from behind that hit the staff member instead. The protagonist realized the bandits had a backup plan. With a loud crash, more bandits burst through the door. One of them, puzzled, asked how anyone could still be alive after they had shot so many bullets at the train. The protagonist, now furious, demanded to know what they were babbling about. One bandit ordered the others to kill him, but when they tried to fire, their guns malfunctioned. They finally realized the protagonist was a mage and had used his powers to disable their weapons. Suddenly, the protagonist sensed something, and at the same time, his magic spell was deactivated. He thought, a counter spell? The bandit mage, surprised, exclaimed that he never would have thought there was another mage on the train. He told the protagonist to give up and promised a painless death if he behaved. One of the other bandits thought to himself that the protagonist didn't appear to be an ordinary man, likely a fourth circle mage, otherwise they would have had intel about another mage on board. The protagonist, unconcerned, wondered if it had already been 10 minutes since the explosion. He realized it would be a while before the train left the mountains, and reinforcements wouldn't arrive anytime soon. Deciding on a course of action, he suddenly jumped off the train. A bandit ordered the others to check on him, and they couldn't see him anywhere. Just as they concluded he must have really jumped, a knife stabbed one of them in the neck. Another bandit spotted the protagonist and shouted that he was on the roof. Confused, another bandit asked how he got there, whether he used a levitation spell, and if it was even possible to keep up with the train's speed. One bandit ordered the others to go after him, while another suggested it was pointless to overpower a mage with numbers. They decided only a few would pursue him while the rest attacked the first car. Some bandits shot at the roof, trying to catch the protagonist off guard. He ran towards the caboose, and as the bandits tried to open the door to the next coach, an explosion occurred. One bandit wondered if there were traps, but another dismissed the idea, saying there was no way the protagonist could have prepared that in such a short time. The bandit leader, tense, realized the protagonist was unlike any other mage he'd encountered, pragmatic and effective with his spells, more like a hunter or mercenary. Suddenly, they heard a loud sound and realized the protagonist was trying to disconnect the cars to escape. The leader cursed himself for not realizing sooner that the protagonist had no reason to fight them. Even as they tried to get to the next car, they were disconnected from the train. A bandit said they couldn't give up the train because of the protagonist, but the leader, having memorized his face, vowed to find and kill him. Before he could finish his sentence, he felt an intense surge of mana and searched for its source. He saw the protagonist casting a huge spell towards them and felt fear, wondering if it was also a trap. He knew they had to run, but it was too late. The spell was cast, killing everyone except the leader. Impressed that the leader survived his attack, the protagonist approached. The leader, angry and desperate, asked why he had killed them and if he had any conscience, mentioning his comrades who had given their lives for change. The protagonist interrupted, mocking the bandit's madness. Confused, the bandit asked, "What?" The protagonist retorted, "Weren't you the ones who tried to kill me first? What right do you have to preach about conscience and making the world a better place? What about the people you've killed?" He reminded the bandit of his vow to kill him, asking who he was to point a finger at him. The protagonist added that he planned to disappear quietly, but since the bandit had seen his face, he'd sleep easier knowing the bandit was dealt with. Before the bandit could respond, he was split in half by a person who looked like a knight. She asked the protagonist if he was alright, assuring him that the Knights of Cold Steel had arrived, and he had nothing to worry about. "We hear multiple gunshots. It seems that we are on a different car and some bandits are firing bullets at someone." One of the bandit asks, "How are they already here? And who knew that they would use levitation magic in this type of weather?" The knight blocks all the bullets with a magic shield and gathers mana in his fist and launches into the bandit and knocks them down immediately. He tells Other Knight that he has cleared cabin 2, and Other Knight replies that they have cleared cabin 1 and they have secured the passengers. They all report to the vice captain that they have secured the entire train. It seems that the Lady Knight was their vice captain. She praises them for their good work and tells them to escort the passengers safely to the next stop. The scene shifts and now we are at Riederbelk station. The Lady Knight knocks on the MC's door and asks him if he is okay and if he was hurt from the terrorist attack. MC replies that he is fine and he was just lost in thoughts. Lady Knight feels relief hearing that. She introduces herself as Veronica DeVille. MC also goes to introduce himself but is interrupted by some detective-looking person. Lady Knight asks what is going on and detective asks her if she is in charge of the knights here. She agrees and says that she is the vice captain Veronica DeVille. The detective introduces himself as Riederbelk's Metropolitan Police and his name is Lemlis. And he heard that there was an attack on the train at the border of Arat Mountain. Veronica admits and says that they took care of all the attackers. Lemlis thanks her and the knights for their hard work but tells her that there was something suspicious about the report they received. He suspects that the train was infiltrated by the gunmen too quickly, even if there was a wizard among them. This is an arcane-engineered train and still it was infiltrated easily. So they think that someone on board might have been an accomplice in this attack. Veronica agrees and says that it makes sense. Lemlis says that it's just a possibility, but they would identify the passengers and send them along their way. Veronica agrees and asks MC if he heard that. MC nods in agreement. She says that there won't be any problem as long as he is honest. MC thinks to himself that he is in trouble. He thinks that there are no issues with Gerrard's identity as the ticket was purchased under normal circumstances and he boarded the train like any other passengers. But he is not Gerrard right now, and in no way he looks like a man in his 40s. He thinks that if he gets investigated it will be only a matter of time before they figure out that his identity is fake, and he'll be hanged if he is lucky but if not, he will be severely tortured. And not to mention there are plenty of police knights outside the train so running away is impossible. And what's more, this vice captain is cruel and shows no mercy to anything that seems wicked. She's smiling at him right now but the moment she finds out that he is suspicious he would be captured by her. Lemlis come back after bringing the guest log. After seeing MC in lost thoughts he asks him if he is alright, and that he is only going to ask for the ID so he doesn't have to feel that much pressure. He asks MC to show his ticket if he still has it. MC shows his ticket and other detective confirms of the ticket. Lemlis checks the guest logs and identifies about the 2 passengers of room 403, Ludger and Gerrard. With a glare he asks MC about the other guest. MC informs him that he was swept away by the bomb and fell towards the cliff when the train was passing by Arat Mountains. With a suspicious gaze Lemlis looks at MC. Just at that moment Veronica arrives and tells Lemlis that MC was not a suspect to begin with. She tells him that MC was fighting the terrorist before she got there and why would he do that if he was working with them? Lemlis asks surprisingly, he was fighting with them? Lemlis realizes the situation and apologizes to MC. Looking at his name again he checks that he is the new professor at Ceoren. Both Veronica and Lemlis are shocked after that information. MC while standing up and collecting his suitcase admits about being the new professor at Ceoren. And tells them that they can address him as Ludger Cherish. Scene shifts and now we are out of the station. Lemlis apologizes to MC, but MC tells him that he arrived quite comfortably thanks to them. Lemlis offers to escort MC to Ceoren but MC refuses. Lemlis insists and says the MC will be paving the way for the future generation of the Empire, and how can he just let MC go? MC in his mind thinks that being with him makes him uncomfortable. MC says that he has some personal matters to attend so there is no need to trouble himself because of him. As he leaves, he says to Veronica that their meeting was short but it was a pleasure. Veronica agrees and says that they'll meet again if it's meant to be. MC in his mind thinks that he finally escaped and thanks real Ludger that his identity saved his life. He feels relieved about the camera technology not being great in this world, and as a result it's hard to tell the difference between MC and Ludger in a photo. Just as he thinks that the worst is over and he can make a new identity and hide for the time being, someone calls him by Ludger's name. It is an employee from Ceoren Academy, and his name is Wolford. He was worried about the attack on train and came personally to greet him. Wolford says that he is relieved that Ludger is safe and tells him that he will take MC to Ceoren Academy. We can see that MC is not happy with this encounter. We can see MC riding in a carriage pulled by a beautiful robotic horse which is being handled by Wolford. Inside the carriage, MC thinks that this is bad. Who knew that they would send someone to pick him up, and not to mention MC doesn't think that Wolford is just an ordinary employee. It's not just his build but the fact that MC didn't notice him approaching at all. He is very least a knight. MC thinks if he used some lame excuse to try and escape, he'll just be suspicious and chase him down. He needs to play safe for now and maybe it will be safer for him to be here. MC thinks as long as Gerrard is pronounced dead, he is nothing but a ghost in this land and it means that no one will notice if someone drags him away or if he disappears, so it will be safer for him to have a real identity right now. That he will act like Ludger Cherish for the time being and he will wait for his chance. Wolford notifies Ludger that they have arrived at Ceoren. MC is surprised after looking at huge land of Ceoren Academy. He thinks, is all of this land part of Ceoren? This is much bigger than what he had imagined. Wolford tells Ludwig that he will take him to the president right away. Ludwig enters president's chamber and introduces himself. President welcomes him and with cunning-looking eyes says that she has been waiting for him. She introduces herself as president of Ceoren, Elsa Willow. Elsa asked the protagonist, now posing as Ludger, about the terrorist incident on the train and whether he was feeling alright. He told her that just when things were getting dangerous, the knights showed up. Elsa seemed relieved, remarking that it would be terrible if Ceoren's newest professor got hurt. The protagonist couldn't help but think, is the Academy's reputation the only thing she cares about? He had been feeling uneasy since arriving and wondered if it was just his imagination. He questioned whether the real Ludger had met Elsa before and if she somehow knew he was an imposter. Just then, Elsa mentioned that it was their first time meeting in person and commented on how strapping he looked, suggesting that the students would be thrilled once the semester started. She handed over the contract, explaining that, as mentioned before, it would be for 2 years, with the wages detailed within. She also mentioned that the academy would provide room and board. As the protagonist read the contract, he was shocked to see his salary was 30 imperial gold coins, equivalent to 30 million in the continent's common currency or about $200,000. He thought he had hit the jackpot but also realized that such a high wage came with high expectations. He wondered if he could handle himself among the geniuses at Ceoren Academy. But he knew backing out now would look suspicious, so he had no choice but to accept. He reassured himself, thinking that fraud, bluffing, and setting the mood were his specialties. With his life experience and theoretical knowledge, he was confident he could impersonate a professor. So, he agreed to sign the contract. Elsa smiled, looking forward to working with him. The protagonist thought to himself that it was just 2 years, and if he could last that long, he'd be free. Later, in his new room, the protagonist marveled at the fact that he had been given an entire house. He reminded himself that he would now have to play the role of a professor. It had been 27 years since he came to this world, reincarnated with the memories of his past life but no special skills. He had grown up with terrible parents and had to learn how to survive on his own. Despite all the hardships and close calls, who would have thought he would end up as a professor at Ceoren Academy? He realized that Ludger's identity provided perfect cover for him. Ludger was from a ruined family in the tiny kingdom of Quoden. He was an only child, and both his parents had passed away. The letters he exchanged with acquaintances were formal and impersonal, meaning few people would recognize him. It was the perfect disguise. Now, all that was left was to prepare his lectures and learn more about Ceoren Academy. He decided to start by getting a lay of the land. Just then, his stomach grumbled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the train incident. He decided to find the cafeteria. 2 weeks passed, and the protagonist sat in a cafe, drinking coffee and reading a newspaper. He thought about how quickly time had flown but was relieved to have completed all the necessary checks and preparations for his classes. With a week left before the semester started, all that remained was the actual execution. As he was thinking about the guests arriving and preparing for orientation, a mysterious figure sat in the chair behind him. The figure, a woman, greeted him, expressing relief that he was safe. She mentioned that the other members were curious about the moves of the First Order, indicating the protagonist. The protagonist was surprised by this sudden encounter but quickly gathered himself, realizing she was talking about Ludger. She asked if his absence was related to the terrorist attack, noting how unexpected it was for the train to be attacked. The protagonist, staying in character, replied that besides that, he needed more information about Ceoren Academy. She was surprised, saying they had already sent all the information. The protagonist explained that he wanted to verify it himself. Internally, he admired how he managed to stay in character as Ludger, avoiding suspicion. He decided to play along, asking if she had taken care of what she was supposed to do. She confirmed that she had, mentioning that she had assassinated the targets at the academy and dealt with the traitor within their organization. She described the gruesome details of how the traitor was punished, making the protagonist feel uneasy. He kept his composure, though. Suddenly, she started apologizing for not reporting it to him earlier. The protagonist realized that this woman was afraid of Ludger. Seizing the opportunity, he told her to forget about it and asked why she had come to see him. She explained that it had been 2 weeks with no word from him, and they were getting worried. The protagonist, sensing an opportunity to establish control, asked in a threatening tone if she thought it was appropriate to act on her own during such a critical time. She immediately apologized, clearly intimidated. He told her to be quiet and pointed out that her outfit was suspicious, asking if she wanted to attract even more attention. He confirmed that she reacted to his every move, further proving her fear of Ludger. He then asked how many people they had gathered. She reported that there were 31 Third Orders and 7 Second Orders, all successfully infiltrated, with other First Orders arriving as planned. The protagonist told her he was done checking and instructed her to leave. She agreed, reminding him to come to the designated place later. The protagonist, focusing on her use of the word come, reprimanded her, asking how she dared to order him around. Terrified, she tried to explain herself, but he cut her off, saying he would decide when a rendezvous was needed and that only someone on his level or higher could request one. When she mentioned the possibility of a higher authority, like the Zero Order, the protagonist confirmed that only they could give him orders. As he walked away, he thought about how dangerous this woman was, with her talk of assassinations and dealing with traitors. She called out to him, asking what he would do when he called them. The protagonist, realizing he hadn't thought that far ahead, kept his composure and simply replied, "Do I have to say that myself?" She quickly backed down, wishing him well. In his bedroom, the protagonist reflects on the identity he has taken on Ludger, a man from a ruined family, no parents, and the youngest fourth circle mage who is now a professor at Ceoren Academy. He realizes he should have been suspicious from the start. The conditions of Ludger's life were too perfect, and that's because they were all fabricated. The letters exchanged with Ludger were likely encrypted messages, and Ludger wouldn't have been able to infiltrate the academy with his real identity. The protagonist feels like he's in deep trouble, wondering why he had to pick such a risky identity. While deciphering the letters, he finds a message from the Zero Order, instructing him to infiltrate Ceoren Academy as a new professor and gain their trust, with further orders to come later. He realizes that Ceoren Academy isn't the only thing he needs to worry about. He wonders what kind of secret society executive gets caught up in a terrorist attack and ends up dead, a person who had planted dozens of spies at Ceoren, no less. It seems the original Ludger should have been more focused on survival. This means the protagonist now has to keep his true identity hidden not only from Ceoren Academy but also from the secret society. He considers that it might be a good thing he made contact with them today. If what they said is true, the secret society is structured into 0, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd orders. The protagonist knows nothing about the Zero Order, but just knowing they exist is valuable information. The critical task now is to identify the other First Order members, because if they were close to the real Ludger, they would know he's an imposter immediately. The ideal scenario for the protagonist is to use Ceoren's power to eliminate the secret society members. No matter how strong the society is, Ceoren has the resources to overpower them if they make a move. He resigns himself to the fact that the next 2 years will be anything but easy. Meanwhile, in the classroom, students are talking among themselves. One mentions that the class on materialization and element manipulation has a new professor. Another points out that the new professor must be skilled to be teaching a second-year class. They discuss how the previous professor quit suddenly after being outdone by a student in front of the whole class. A yellow-haired girl, pointing to Flora, says they're talking about her. Flora, looking uninterested, says she didn't do anything special, she just pointed out that the professor's technique was wrong. The students continue gossiping, mentioning that the new professor has an impressive record, having been a former military officer and published many dissertations. But when someone mentions that the professor comes from a ruined family, some students start speculating that his class might be easy to pass. Flora, however, finds these conversations boring. Finally, the protagonist enters the classroom and greets the students, introducing himself as their new professor, Ludger Cherish. His presence alone silences the room. He informs them that they are still in the course correction period, so he won't start the lessons right away, but he has an announcement. He explains that while his class will cover the theory of materialization, he will also go beyond that and focus on practical applications. He adds that first-year students can also sign up for this class, not just the second years. The class starts murmuring, and the protagonist quickly tells them to be quiet. He acknowledges their dissatisfaction but assures them that he won't lower the standards of his lectures, so they don't need to worry about that. A student, whom he vaguely recognizes, raises her hand and asks why he's allowing first-year students to attend a second-year class. He replies that, as an educator, he believes everyone should be taught equally, regardless of their grade. He assures them that his lectures will be different from what they've heard before. The student questions whether he'll be able to explain things properly, given the mixed levels in the class. The protagonist, wanting to keep some mystery, says it wouldn't be fun to reveal everything in advance and suggests they attend the next class if they're curious. He then warns the students that just because he's a new professor, they shouldn't expect an easy A. If anyone thinks they can coast through his class, he'll make sure they regret that complacency. Inwardly, the protagonist hopes fewer students will attend his class. Even though he's prepared, he knows it'll be more comfortable for him with a smaller group. He's sure the second-year students won't like sitting with first years, and his warning about the difficulty of the class should deter some from enrolling. He ends the class by asking if there are any questions. The students, clearly intimidated by his military background and reputation as a fourth circle mage, remain silent. Flora, however, seems surprised by the whole situation. As the class ends, the protagonist is a bit taken aback that no one asked any questions, though it's a relief for him. He had prepared answers but now finds them unnecessary. As he leaves the classroom, he wonders if the students are deliberately looking down on him or if he might have been too harsh. Walking through the corridor, he notices that everyone seems to be avoiding him, confirming his suspicions. Just then, someone greets him from behind. She introduces herself as Selena, a new professor like him. The protagonist greets her in return and asks how he can help. She smiles and asks if he's had lunch yet. The scene shifts to a garden where all the new professors have gathered. One of them introduces himself as Brino, a teacher of the Golem class, part of the invocation department. Another, Merida, introduces herself as a teacher of charms and vision, which is part of the curses and benediction department. Ludger introduces himself next, mentioning that he teaches materialization. Merida is visibly impressed by Ludger's appearance and comments on how handsome he is up close. Ludger politely thanks her, but he notices another professor glaring at him. Merida informs him that this is Chris Benamor, a nobleman. Ludger muses that the new group of professors includes one nobleman, someone from a ruined family, himself, and 3 commoners. Despite their backgrounds, they are all experts in their fields, which makes Ludger suspect that one of them could be another First Order member. Chris, clearly upset, says he was curious about the new professors but is disappointed to find a ruined nobleman and some commoners among them. He tells them not to drag him down and that they can have fun without him, especially directing his disdain toward Ludger. He warns Ludger not to show off just because he's a ruined nobleman. Merida, angry at Chris, retorts that being a noble doesn't give him the right to look down on others. She reassures Ludger not to worry about Chris's attitude. Ludger, remaining calm, says he's fine and invites the others to join him for the meal they had planned earlier. He thinks to himself that, for now, he's content that he won't have to eat alone. Later that night, a discussion about Ludger takes place on a magic forum. Participants talk about him being the youngest wizard to reach the 4th circle, his service as a military officer, and his participation in cryptid hunts. His name is listed as a freelance mage in the Magic Tower. It turns out that the person sharing this information is a student who is part of the secret society and wants to help Ludger gain more students in his class. Other students are surprised to hear that first-year students can also attend his class and, seeing nothing to lose, they all decide to sign up the next day. As Ludger walks down the hallway, he thinks about how many students might show up to his class. He recalls all the warnings he gave about his class being a landmine, expecting almost no one to sign up. He figures that if anyone did, it would only be because other classes were full. He guesses that at most 30 students might show up. When Ludger enters the classroom, he is shocked to see all 80 seats filled, with even first-year students among them. The new students feel a bit intimidated by his presence, given his military background. Ludger wonders if they feel uncomfortable being in the same class as upperclassmen. He starts to think that someone might be trying to sabotage him, not realizing that it's his own alias within the secret society that's actually supporting him. He quickly calms down and introduces himself again, acknowledging the many new faces. He announces that he'll be teaching the overall process of materialization. When a student asks if he means the 4 specialties, Ludger glares at him, reminding the class that questions are only allowed when he permits them. He lets it slide since it's the first day, but warns that anyone who disrupts the class flow or challenges his authority in the future will lose points. However, he also mentions that there will be opportunities to earn reward points, encouraging students to work hard. Since the student had already asked, Ludger confirms that he will indeed be teaching all 4 specialties: materialization, element manipulation, telekinesis, and fortification, key components of conjuration. Some students think that teaching 2 specialties would be challenging enough, but he's going to cover all 4? Flora, one of the students, thinks he might be exaggerating. Ludger, sensing their skepticism, says that since it's their first class, he wants to show them something interesting to pique their curiosity. He demonstrates third circle elemental fire magic, explaining how he combines various processes: heat, combustion, compression, acceleration, expansion, and diffusion to complete the formula. He claims that what he's about to show them will allow them to manifest the formula 3 times faster than traditional methods. The students are stunned, questioning if it's even possible to shorten the time to manifest a spell or if Ludger is bluffing. A yellow-haired girl asks Flora if she thinks he's telling the truth. Flora, still skeptical, replies that she doesn't know. She adds that without changing the fundamental structure of the formula, it's impossible unless he's using a magical medium like scrolls or reverberation, both of which have significant limitations. Flora thinks that if that's what Ludger is planning to use, she'll be disappointed. Noticing their curiosity, Ludger invites them to ask a few questions. One student named Alex asks how Ludger can reduce the time to manifest a spell. Ludger simply responds that he'll show them, reiterating that he reduced the time. Another student, Dahlia, asks if that means he improved the technique. Ludger clarifies that he didn't tamper with the formula. Instead, he found a way to reduce the manifestation time while maintaining the existing formula. Flora, one of the students, speaks up. She confidently states that as a second-year student, she finds it impossible to believe what the professor is claiming. The other students murmur in surprise, noting that Flora has finally spoken up. Some even whisper that this new professor might meet the same fate as the one he replaced. The protagonist, now known as Professor Ludger, calmly says that he doesn't recall opening the floor for comments but encourages Flora to continue. He asks why she believes it's impossible. Flora explains that the only way to reduce a spell's manifestation time is through repeated practice and proficiency. She doubts Ludger can do something no one else has ever managed to accomplish. With a stern tone, Ludger challenges her, asking what if he's not talking about advancing magic in the traditional sense but attempting something entirely new? He points out that while magic has remained stagnant, clinging to tradition and history, science has continued to advance, even threatening the existence of magic. He clarifies that he's not arguing that science is superior to magic, but rather that there is room for improvement and innovation in magic as well. He insists that magic can be advanced, and he intends to be the first to do it. Flora, taken aback, asks if he really means that. She wonders to herself who this professor thinks he is, with such confidence in his own abilities. Ludger then asks Flora if she knows the average time it takes to create a rolling flame spell. Flora replies that it varies, but for a third circle magician, it usually takes about 10 seconds. The time can be reduced to 5 seconds for a higher circle magician. Ludger acknowledges her answer but says he's not interested in methods used by higher circle magicians. Instead, he wants to know the average standard for the students in this room. Flora replies that for most students, it takes about 5 seconds at best, though she can do it much faster. Ludger, impressed by her confidence, invites her to demonstrate her skill before the class. Flora agrees and performs a rolling flame spell quickly and efficiently. Ludger notes that it took her 4.78 seconds to manifest the flame, which is incredibly fast for a second-year student. However, he adds that 4.78 seconds is still too slow, mentioning that the fastest record for a third circle mage is 4.41 seconds, which he still considers much too slow. Flora, determined, says she's sure she can improve with more practice. Ludger, however, emphasizes that he considers even the 4.41 second record to be slow. The class is stunned, and they start murmuring among themselves, wondering how fast Ludger can do it. Ludger tells them to watch closely as he demonstrates the rolling flame spell. The students are surprised by his technique, noting that it didn't even take him a second to complete the spell. Flora is shocked, thinking to herself that what he just did didn't follow the usual technique for a rolling flame, and there was no visible process before the spell's manifestation. Ludger asks if they all watched carefully and offers to show them one more time in case they missed it. The students are left in awe, and Ludger thinks to himself that the look in their eyes has finally changed. He reveals that the rolling flame he just manifested took only 0.24 seconds, a far cry from the old record. He admits that the technique might have looked strange to them because what he used wasn't the standard rolling flame technique. He explains that it was a technique for improving the technique itself. The students are confused, murmuring among themselves, "A technique for the technique? What does that even mean?" Ludger elaborates, saying that in other words, he input his value and obtained an output, similar to a blueprint. He compares the biological hardware of mages to a computer, with mana as the program that runs and manifests as software, which they understand to be magic. He calls this concept the source code. The students are bewildered, never having heard of such a type of magic before. They start to wonder who this professor really is. Ludger then asks Flora if he has answered her question. Flora, still in shock, nods. Ludger, maintaining his authoritative tone, points out that Flora interrupted his lesson rudely because she couldn't handle being confronted with knowledge she didn't understand. He asks if she agrees, and Flora quietly nods, saying, "I do." Ludger then declares that because she directly challenged his authority, there will be consequences. Flora Lumos will be given 10 penalty points. The class is surprised that Flora, of all people, received penalty points. Flora, clenching her lips, quietly returns to her seat. But then, Ludger acknowledges that the rolling flame technique she demonstrated was perfect, so he will also reward her 10 points. He adds that he doesn't hate students who are skilled and appreciates Flora for her effort. Flora thanks him, visibly relieved. The yellow-haired girl next to Flora asks if she's okay, and Flora, still a bit shaken, says she's fine. Ludger, removing his jacket, announces that they shall now begin the lecture. He explains that the source code will be taught only to a handful of students he selects based on how well they keep up with his class. He urges them to do their best if they want to learn this advanced technique. The atmosphere in the room grows tense. One of the students thinks to himself that everyone kept saying how odd this new professor was, and he had his doubts about the class. But now, he can see that Ludger is amazing. The class ends, and Ludger instructs them to review what they learned today. As the students leave, one comments on how incredible the source code technique was, saying he never expected to see something like that. Another student, however, dismisses their amazement, pointing out how obvious it is that they lack understanding. He mutters that this is why they're all just commoners.